Welcome back to FlaskCon. If you were expecting Phil Jones, you're probably as bummed as I am that I am not Phil Jones. He was able to make it if you weren't here earlier, and so we just swapped mine in down here. So my name is Adam Englander. I'm one of the community people for palettes, and giving a presentation on single-page apps in Flask/Quart. There's very little difference in Flask and Quart, which is one of the awesome things about Quart, if you've never heard about it. Quart is the asynchronous, I guess it's the alternate universe version of Flask. This presentation was originally supposed to be 10 minutes, but it was sparked on a conversation that we had inside of the Palettes Discord. So if you're not on the Palettes Discord, there's actually just interesting stuff about stuff that comes up that you're like, oh, that's a much better way to do things. And we were discussing how single-page apps work. And David and I have very different use cases. In my particular use case, we did something very different that I guess most people don't do. So I thought, oh, I'll give a talk about it. That'll be simple enough. So the premise here is why we're doing a single-page app with Flask. We're actually using Quart, but most people probably don't, so I did the presentation on Flask. It's basically the same thing. But I have a project, the main product of a new company I'm working with, and they do AI-assisted insurance claim adjuster application. And because it's using AI models, it has very long running request times. So async was a necessity for that because your request time can be 3 minutes to wait for the AI model to respond back as you send it an entire insurance policy and ask it to give the citations for why you should be denying this claim. So we knew that in order to be able to support volume, asynchronous I/O was going to be necessary for us to do that. And so we took a look at that, and it needed to be async in order for that to kind of work. So that kind of led us to tool selection. And although I am a palettes person and have been for quite some time, there was no guarantee that this was going to be based on one of the palettes projects. So we did kind of a blank slate assessment of what do we need and what's out there to do it, because sometimes you just want to pick the best tool for the best job. And so on the JavaScript side, we took a look at all of the most popular single-page applications. Popular is important because you get more help from projects that are popular, especially when you're trying weird things. Angular and React kind of met those qualifications. And more of the engineers had experience with React and Angular. I think I was the only one that had ever used Angular. So we picked React for the front end. And then on the Python side, we primarily looked at Quart and FastAPI. There are others, but those are, FastAPI is the most popular for async APIs and would have worked just fine. But most of the folks, well, actually everyone that had used Python had used Flask. And it was the team felt it was an easier transition to asynchronous Python to do it with a framework that they already knew and understood, that they didn't have to try and figure out, is it because I'm doing async wrong or because I'm doing the framework wrong? So we picked Quart as it has a Flaskish API. So now that we had tools, we had architecture decisions to make, and these were probably the most important. If you've ever worked on a Python / single-page app JavaScript application before, there are mistakes that will be made. We've made them, I've made them, I'm sure you've made them, that you're like, wow, I wish it just wasn't this difficult sometimes. And so we wanted to take those things in and kind of have the experiences that we've learned. And one of the big things is that it needed to be easy for Python developers. We don't have a primary JavaScript developer. And so we wanted to learn as few JavaScript tools as possible. everything you can that makes sense in Python, because we're Python developers, and when something goes wrong and you have a tool that you don't understand, and if you look at the code, it makes no sense to you, it's not super helpful. And if you've taken a look at library code for utilities in JavaScript, if you're not really good at JavaScript, they're really confusing. And they also tend to work in a different way, right? I think it's common in most languages, like utilities work a particular way in a particular language. And so you try and do it the way that they work in Python, but they work differently. They expect you to work with it differently in JavaScript. And it's stressful enough when things go wrong. The less you can pull out I don't even understand the language that I'm having to work with, the less stress it is. So that was one big piece of it. And we also wanted one process for building. So I'm a big fan of reducing at all possible it worked on my box syndrome. So whatever you have working in development should work the same way on production, and you should be able to reproduce what's going on in production locally. And if you've worked with single page apps and backend APIs for that, that can be challenging. And even more of a challenge to get it to build sometimes. So when we're using Flask/Quart, there's still some differentiation in a development environment. Very few people are running Green Unicorn to test out their stuff, right? Or they're running an ASCII server. They're usually running the Flask or Quart dev server. But Python engineers and Flask/Quart engineers are familiar enough with the changes there that they know what they're going to screw up. Like, this is fine in the dev server, but it's not going to work on a production server. And all of our stuff deploys on Docker anyway, so if it really gets that crazy, you can just bring up a Docker development environment and spin it up there and take a look at it. Which is, again, much easier if you have a single server, right? So debugging, doing automated testing, releasing gets so much easier when you only have one server. Every other time I've done single page apps, it's been you have a web server that has a single page app, and you have a WSGI server or an ASCII server that runs your Python and runs your Flask or your Quart, which means you have to coordinate API, you have to coordinate releases, or you have to version all of your releases. It creates this massive complication of, okay, well, this server's running this part of the front end, this server's running that part of the back end. You've got to make sure that they don't get out of sync because your app just stops working. So if at all possible, it wasn't an absolute requirement, but if at all possible, we wanted to run on one server. That way we can reduce having to do 2 releases for deprecation, where you have to release the stuff that supports both and then remove the old stuff. And if you've ever had to deal with that, you know what a pain it is and just how difficult it can be. There may be a day when that needs to happen, right? As the application gets larger, it gets more complex, and we need to provide certain functionality in different places. It may make sense to split it out. It might make sense for it to be microservices. It might make sense for a lot of stuff, but today is not that day, right? It's a team of 3 people working on a single Flask app that has a single page app in front of it. So there's no real need for that to happen. And again, orchestrating releases, it's a lot easier to do the automation when it's just one deploy. So what that brought us to is a single application with a Flask. Again, ours is Quart, but it doesn't matter. And it serves React-generated static assets, right? So Flask can serve static assets, right? If you've ever done a website using Flask, you served a static asset. And so it's no different serving a single page app as it is just serving HTML and JPEGs and PNGs and CSS. And it serves an API for dynamic content. And then the React front end is the single page app. We use the browser router for full URL linking. It's not a requirement, but people tend to understand URLs better. Like if they want to go get to something, they'll bookmark something. At some point, it's not as important for this project, but you get way better search engine optimization if you're using URLs as opposed to a URLs plus a hash afterwards. So there's a lot of good things there. We decided it would be managed by Vite, not because Vite's amazing and awesome, but it's so much easier just to build a stupid single-page app. And again, we're not JavaScript experts. It just made all the tools. We didn't have to think about, well, what are we going to do for building? And what tool are we going to use? And are we going to compress? And are we going to, it just handled all of that. So it took out, that one wasn't even my decision. That was somebody else's decision. It was one of the best decisions we've ever made. Again, there's probably another tool that works as well, but to have a tool that just, you tell Vite to install a single-page app for React, and it just sticks everything you need in there. That was fantastic. And so we come back to why is Flask serving the SPA content? All the things that we wanted, right? It's got coordinated release to front end and the back end. It's got development and production used in the same process. Simplified configurations for routing. And we do a lot of integration testing. I'm a big fan of BDD. And I even give presentations sometimes on doing it. I've done it at FlaskCon, or at PyCon. That's really important to optimize QA resources and to reduce bugs. So we're just really, really big on it, which is also something else you're constantly optimizing because it's now taking up to 20 minutes to run a full suite, but it's better than spending 6 hours doing it manually. And there's no additional JavaScript tooling for serving content. So that's one thing that you lose in what we're doing, and that was kind of the conversation that David and I were having, is that he actually has a JavaScript person. And so they want to work inside of JavaScript tools, which is fine for his project. For my project, we don't have that. Right? We have some polyglots that are really good at Python and can write some JavaScript. What we're losing is we're losing the in-app reload, right? So if you've ever done anything with a single-page app, they have a dev server that runs, and when you change code, it just pushes the code out instead of refreshing, which is super helpful. If you're in a particular point that took you 10 clicks to get there, it had to fill in 6 forms. So there's a definite value to the JavaScript development server. We just didn't see it as a high enough value. Right, so instead of having that, it just it does a build watch. And just anytime the JavaScript changes, it rebuilds it, sticks it back in that static directory, deletes the directory, puts all the stuff back. You hit refresh, you've got the new code. So that's from a more standard setup. That's one of the big differences. The project setup is this is an example project. The cleanest way to do it is to have just separate backend, front-end directories, and all the backend stuff's in backend, all the front-end stuff's in front-end. That can create complexities as far as we use Docker, and getting Docker to move the right stuff to the right place because you've got to build the JavaScript separately, then you build the Python, and that can get confusing and weird. And so we actually went to an alternate setup. So the alternate setup is that we have everything Python. It's a Python project anyway. So you set up the Python project just like you normally would. And then you have all of the Vite configuration in the root. And then you have a front end. Because you can tell Vite, and it's an interesting little trick. It's a little more convoluted. But you have to tell Vite, hi, the front end is in the front end directory. So even though all of your configuration is here, you're going to be actually building it, the source is here, and you're going to compile it to another place. So that's what we're currently using. Because the other one was, again, we're also not super great at Docker, but it was just so much of a hassle to get all the things to know where they're supposed to be and build in the right place that we just went with a different configuration where everything about the project, package JSON, requirements text, all in the root. So you just start from there and you know where you're going instead of having to go to the README and figure out what directory to go in to build this, what directory to build that. But I will say that the regular setup is cleaner, right? All the Python in one, all the JavaScript in another. And it might be a good place to start. It works just as easy. And so if you wanted to do a front-end setup from scratch, there's not a lot of work. You need to create the Vite front end, and we chose React TypeScript because TypeScript works a lot like Python. And it was easier for us to understand. We do a lot of typed Python, so the typing didn't bother us. And then you just tell it to create the template, where to stick it, and then tell npm to install it. And then npm installs all of the installs all libraries. If you use an alternate, I know there's alternates. I haven't used JavaScript primarily for at least 8 years, so it was the only thing then. But it'll still work with whatever alternate package manager you want to use. There is a change that you have to make for the Vite config, is that you have to tell it where to build the output to. Because normally it's going to build it in the local directory, in the project directory. And you don't want it there. You want it to build it into your Flask project. So you have to edit the Vite config, and yours won't be TS if it's not a TypeScript project, but it's edit your Vite config to send the output to backend static. So that was the only real change that we made in the entire project, is that we had to tell the compiler, hey, don't go to your normal directory when you build this, put it in this particular directory. And so what that does is that every time you build a JavaScript, it just puts it into or the Python static directory or the Flask static directory. And we were using the default, so it's /static at the root. And then Flask knows to serve files from there. And so if you're familiar with single-page apps, right, they have an index file that you shouldn't really change because they have an index.js and an index.html, and they're going to do all the crazy things, and you shouldn't modify it because it's going to change it anyway. So as long as you don't change how that's built, Flask will operate as expected. And there's two ways you can do that as well. You can either tell Vite that all the root starts under static, which is what we moved to. We originally had it being, we changed the static path in Flask to /, which you can do, although it creates problems. And I don't think, I apologize, I didn't update in here. So you need to tell Vite that when it's building that the index file will reference all of the things that it's adding into it under the static directory, /static. So it knows what to do there. And then if you're using the standard, you need to specifically tell it to empty the output directory, because if it's not in the root of the project. So it's outside the project, so it by default won't just delete things. If you use the alternate format, it'll just work just fine. Backend setup from scratch is the stuff you'll probably be the most familiar with. You just pip install Flask and Green Unicorn. Create the app.py and add your blueprint and a catch-all route. So one of the things that I did, that this was actually a project I wanted to see if we could do, because we didn't actually originally do this as a blueprint, but it works so well as a blueprint that we're changing our actual code base to use the blueprint. So the catch-all route is how the routes for the single-page app show the index.html. Right? It always just shows the same file, whatever route you're on, because we're using the path-based router, the browser router, is that whatever page you give us, we're just going to return index.html. So when you give us /users, it just returns index.html. And when you give us /organizations, it just returns index.html, because the single page app is the only thing that does the routing. So it's a way for you to allow people to bookmark or do whatever they want to do. And the web server returns, the Flask server returns the correct page. And then I made a very, very simple blueprint for the API. So what this is saying is that there's a blueprint called API. So everything that's /API will now go to the blueprint. And so you have an application that anything that's /API something, /something goes to your API code, and everything else returns index.html. So you have the single page app, whatever route you want, and then your API stuff you just kind of prepend with /API, and it's going to go there. So I made a really dumb but way to dynamically get things that's not super dynamic on what are all the HTTP status codes. I don't know why. It was one of the few. It's one of the few enums that actually spits out something that's interesting in the core Python library. And so for JavaScript, it's just using, again, this is going to be really weird if you're not used to doing stuff in React. But this is just, the React is contacting the code. It says, OK, cool. I'm going to load the user data. I'm going to spit it out there. And here's the first bug in the presentation that doesn't actually show you calling the API. But basically, it just calls /API/status codes and creates a list of things. And I'm only showing this because it's the JavaScript that does it, but there's nothing special in there. And